One of the most important things you can do when learning German is reading, and that is because of two reasons. The first one is that you're engaging with the real language as opposed to artificially constructed sentences that you might see in a textbook or in a language app. And the second one is that if you're reading something interesting, you get engaged with it and you temporarily forget that this is written in a different language, or you may not completely forget that it's written in a different language, but at least you pay less and less attention to analyzing the grammar. You care less about whether you really know all these grammar rules or not, because you want to know what's going to happen next. Now, when you start learning German, of course, you cannot read a whole story right away because you don't know the language yet. And that's when you have to follow a course, follow a textbook. And that is also why at Kameleon, the first part of the app is called Learn, where you learn the basic structures of the language and how to build sentences. But then as soon as you feel comfortable enough, it's very important to move on to read and start reading stories. But how do you read stories when your level is not good enough yet? I mean, this is Franz Kafka. That's very advanced. How are you going to read this? Well, of course, you're going to struggle with specifically this book, but there are ways of reading simpler texts, and it is actually getting easier and easier over time. There are these kind of books called graded readers, which are written in specifically simplified ways, and you can also find graded readers of classic novels that are rewritten in a simplified way so that it is easier to read them. But what is common nowadays is, of course, to use AI. You can ask AI, generate me a text written at an A2 level or at a B1 level in German about this and that, and then you can use that to read that text. So it is important to read stories, and it's only possible to do that if you have stories that are written at your level, because otherwise you will really struggle reading them. And this is also why within Kameleon, in the read section, we have a huge library of lots of stories on all different kinds of topics, and that are written at different levels, so you can filter and find stories at an A2 level or at a B1 level. And the advantage there is that in those stories you can click on any word or any sentence and translate them, and you can create flashcards out of them so that you can come back and practice them later on. So the power of reading is that you're engaging with the real language. You're not engaging with a list of grammar rules or exercises where you have to try to fill in the missing word or so, but you're engaging with the language, and you're learning the language by absorbing it, by not analyzing it all the time, but by getting used to the patterns of the language. And that is eventually the only way that you can learn German, because you cannot speak the language fluently if you're constantly thinking about the grammar rules, if you're constantly thinking about the words. It's impossible in terms of time to think about the grammar rules, think about all the words, and speak fluently at the same time. But it's not only a question about time that you cannot think that fast. It's also not the natural way of speaking. Nobody speaks their native language by constantly thinking about rules. How do you speak your native language? You just know how to speak it because you've heard it so many times. It's so internalized in you that you just know how to form the sentences. And that is the only way to learn any language. And to get to that level, you need to absorb the language a lot. You need to really spend a lot of time reading, listening, speaking, reading, and so kind of imprinting the patterns of the language inside of you. You can always go back to look at grammar tables, to practice flashcards, and that is definitely very useful. But eventually, the only way to become fluent is to really keep absorbing the language again and again. And that's why it's important to read things that are interesting, that interest us, so that we want to keep on reading. So something that I've been doing is to really think about what the topics are that interest me, that I'm very passionate about, and to go and read texts about those topics. So for example, I'm quite interested in transport planning and city planning. Now, I could read the Wikipedia articles about that, and I have done that with some languages. But you also need to try out these things in order to realize that not every source is equally useful for learning a language. So, for example, Wikipedia articles are very often written in a slightly academic way or slightly advanced way. So, for example, if you read articles in the German Wikipedia, they may sometimes use words which in the colloquial language almost nobody uses. So what I did is I went to forums. I think forums are a really great place for finding text that is easy to read, because in forums you have people who write in their own way. They write the way that they would speak most often. So if you go to, for example, Reddit, now Reddit often has very, very short texts and sentences, so there's not that much that you can read there. So in German, for example, there's this forum called gutefrage.net, where people can ask questions. It's a little bit like Quora. And there is, of course, the German version of Quora, which you can check out. So there you can find people asking questions about all kinds of topics, and you just try to filter for the topics that interest you. And you can read people having discussions and longer conversations about these topics in rather colloquial language. Now, what you can do is, if you struggle to look up words, you can copy and paste these kind of texts in Kameleon. So in Kameleon, there is an import function where you can copy paste this whole text, and then you upload it into the app and you can read it there. You can look up the words there, and you can save the flashcards there. So it is always there, and it's very easy for you to always go back to this article in case you want to read it again. Because that is something that I also find is really helpful, to read things twice. Because the only way to become fluent, as I said, is to internalize the patterns of the language. But unfortunately, there are so many different things that one could say, right? There are so many possible sentences, so many things. And if you only hear something once, then it's more difficult to internalize it. You need to hear it again and again. And that's why I think it really helps a lot to read the same story twice. If it's a short story, a 10-minute story or so, read it twice, read it 3 times until you internalize it more and more, so that you hear mit dem Freund 2 times, 3 times, so that you hear zum Park 3 times, and you internalize more and more that it is mit dem Freund or zum Park, without knowing specifically that this is because of this rule or that rule, but you just internalize that this is the way that you say it. So I hope this motivates you to start reading more in German. And as always, if you have any other topics that you want me to cover, write them in the comments down below, and I'll definitely make a video about them. I recently made a video about the mindset of how to learn grammar in German, which I'll link up here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.